A comment by Alec Venner questioned my use of the term failure. I wanted to discuss those terms: failure, winner, success, loser, this dichotomy, which also relates back into the master-slave dichotomy I was talking about. Is it a positive thing to identify as a winner? Is it a negative thing to identify as a loser? We could imagine a situation in which someone has been born into inherited success. They didn't do anything. Someone like Paris Hilton, I don't know, some kind of heiress, some kind of inheritor of wealth, someone who has done nothing, but wealth has just merely fallen into their lap. They haven't done anything to deserve it. They haven't earned it. And they have a perception of success. They say, I'm a winner, I'm a succeeder, I'm someone who is on top in this society. Is that a positive place for that person to be? Because what might end up happening is their conception of themselves as infallible is going to prevent themselves from working on their weaknesses. They're going to make this assumption that they're always right. They're going to use their wealth to compensate for their flaws. They're never going to grow as a person. And ultimately what this means over time is that their wealth will diminish, that they're going to squander their wealth. They're going to make unwise investments. They're going to be hedonistic. They're going to waste their wealth. And they might go bankrupt, or they might leave nothing for their children, or they might make poor choices, poor marital choices. They might have a divorce. Their children might inherit their laziness and their bad qualities, and they might, further squander the wealth. So having the perception of oneself as being a success, being a winner, being infallible, being on top, isn't always a good thing. But we know that the other direction can be just as dangerous. If someone identifies as a failure, that's also problematic. If you say everything I do leads to failure, then why bother doing anything? That kind of mindset lends itself to hedonism and apathy and suicide and depression. It leads to a sort of laziness in the opposite direction. The successful person, the inheritor, says, I'm so good, I'm so awesome, anything I do is right. And therefore they never question their decisions. Therefore they have no motivation to take stock of themselves and to reevaluate their direction and to make changes and adjustments. The same is true of the person who believes themselves to be an ultimate failure. They have no reason to change course because everything, whereas the former person, everything they touch, like a King Midas, everything turns to gold. The person who conceives of themselves as a total failure, everything they touch just turns to muck, it turns to rot, it turns to ruin. And so they have no incentive to try to improve or try to get beyond their current station because they have this conception of themselves as being totally depraved. And as I say that, I'm reminded of the Calvinist doctrine of depravity, that man in his essence is totally fundamentally depraved. Again, I bring that back to Judaism because I think Calvinism and the Protestant movement, the sola scriptura analysis, the idea that you have to go back to the Bible, you have to ignore Catholic tradition, you have to go back to the Bible to understand the Old Testament, to understand the Jews. And they would go, in their translations of the Bible, they would go to the Jews and they'd say, hey, what does this passage mean in Hebrew? What does this Hebrew mean? And the Jews would tell them, oh, this is how you should translate your Bible into English or German or whatever it was. And so at first, even Martin Luther was friendly toward the Jewish community, and he said, we just have to be more evangelical, and then later he changed his mind about that. But at first, in translating the Bible and learning Hebrew, he had to engage with the Jewish community. This is true of a lot of Protestants. They wanted to go back to Judaism. And there is this concept in Judaism that man by himself is totally depraved. Solomon says, I have everything, and yet I have nothing because I don't have God. And so Job, the reverse of Solomon, is Job, who has nothing, but he still has faith, he still has hope in God, and therefore he's able to persevere and survive all of the afflictions that meet him. So this conception of success and failure, what does it mean? What are the extremes? Is there some kind of Aristotelian golden mean we should be striving for, where we never view ourselves as perfect, but we also never view ourselves as fully depraved or beyond hope, beyond salvation? I think that is a value of Christianity, that Christianity is able to take people who obviously were feeling pretty depraved. I mean, if you imagine you live as not one of the disciples necessarily, but you live as a Galilean, or you live as a Samaritan, or you live as I believe Timothy was half Gentile, half Jewish. So a lot of these early Christians, they were mixed marriages. They were the children of mixed marriages of Jews and Greeks. And if they looked at the Jewish tradition, they were starting from a point of total depravity, because they would look at it and they would say, well, if you're mixed, you're a Samaritan, and you're worthless, and you're a dog. This is what Jesus says. He says Samaritans are like dogs because they're mixed. They're not pure like me. Look at my ancestry. The New Testament opens with Jesus' ancestry. Don't let anyone tell you that ancestry is not important in Christianity. If it opens the first page, the first passages, the first verses, it's all about, this guy was descended from that guy, and that guy bequeathed this guy, and whatever up until Jesus. And so Jesus is descended from all these important people like David and Abraham, going back to Adam. Obviously, it's very important. And so there were a lot of people at that time in the Mediterranean who were partly Jewish, partly Greek, or something else, and they were confused, and they came from a point of view of, well, from the Jewish point of view, I'm totally depraved. I'm like goyim. I'm like an animal. And so what can I do? You need a new perspective. If you just wallow in that, it leads to suicide. And so Christianity came along and said, yeah, we're going to affirm the Jewish tradition. We're going to affirm your total depravity, but it's okay because you're not uniquely depraved. Humanity is actually universally depraved, and therefore you have nothing to feel bad about, because Jesus is going to come along with his perfection, which cancels out your depravity, gives you a new heart, replaces your heart of stone with a heart of flesh, and allows you to make progress and to make strides through the power of the Holy Spirit. So that concept there is necessary. If you have people who are growing up in a racially supremacist society and they're half caste, they're Michelin, whatever, then they need a new worldview to come along and to reconcile sort of this immovable object and unstoppable force. And the immovable object is Jewish doctrine and Jewish racial thinking, and the unstoppable force is the need for people to solve the paradox of, how do I be a good person if Jewish law says I was born depraved, I was born an animal, I was born a half caste, I was born a Samaritan? How do you square that circle? And Christianity is what comes along in all of its paradoxical nature, but it comes along and says there's some kind of mystical deus ex machina, literally, where God just comes out of the sky, he inseminates a virgin, and he says, here, Jesus Christ is going to wipe away your sins. The sins that, you were born with original sin, the original sin. A lot of Christian identity people will say that the serpent in the Garden of Eden, actually, the sin there was a sexual sin. It was the sin of race mixing. And I think within the Christian context, that makes a lot of sense. That the sin that these Samaritans were born, people like Timothy, they were born with the sin of being half Greek, half Jewish. And sometimes it wasn't necessarily a genealogical thing or a genetic thing. Sometimes it was just a Jewish person who grew up in a Greek culture, like Nimrod, the Hellenized Jews. I mean, Jewish culture, as I talked about in the last video, they call it the synagogue. Synagogue is a Greek word. So the purity of Judaism was being assailed. The concept that Jews should remain separate from other people, it was the sole doctrine to be held above all other doctrines. And it's reflected in all of Jewish ritual. So the concept that the rabbi should be separate from the other members of the congregation symbolized the separateness of the Jewish people from their neighbors, the separateness of the Ark of the Covenant from the rabbis, and then the separateness of the Sabbath day from the other days of the week. So there's constantly this concept of, okay, well, these are the kosher foods and these are the clean foods. These are the clean people, these are the unclean people. There's this constant refrain of separation within Judaism. You can't mix, wool with other kinds of fabrics with polyester. They didn't call it polyester back then, but you can't mix different kinds of fabrics together. You can't, maybe, I don't know, maybe they can't even write on pieces of paper that are mixed parchments. I'm not sure, but this spirit of separation, of keeping the unclean separate from the clean, is at the essence of Judaism. And when these people in the 1st century AD are confronted with the problem of increasing cultural mixing and racial mixing, they need a solution for this identity crisis, and Christianity comes along and gives them a solution. That's why Christianity is so powerful. Now, Christianity over the centuries becomes codified, it continues to evolve, it goes in different directions, and Christianity becomes Germanized, it becomes Europeanized. That's not how it started off, however. But this is sort of at the root of Christianity, and it's interesting that Europe, at the same time that a lot of alchemists were becoming interested in Islam, they were becoming interested in Judaism and the Kabbalah, at the same time, this is when the Protestants decide, okay, we need to go back to the Bible. We need to reject tradition, we need to go back to the Bible. There's this concept of Europe is what it is, and it needs to break out of itself, it needs to break into something new. And that manifests esoterically as, Kabbalism, and Hermeticism, and paganism and alchemy. It manifests in that way, but then it also manifests as Protestantism going back to the Jewish text, going back to the Greek text, not relying on the Vulgate, not relying on the Latin tradition. So that concept of kind of visiting a foreign culture by going back in time, it's an interesting concept, and it's one for Europe that just emerged from the Black Death. I mean, the Black Death happens in the 14th century, and Europe emerges, and Europe survives, and Europe repopulates. And at that point, the question is, okay, what now? We've overcome this huge hurdle, this huge earth-shattering event. Where do we go next? Because the Vikings have been taken care of. The Slavs have been taken care of. Spain, at this point, 1492, Spain has been taken care of. So a lot of the external threats that preoccupied Europeans, that kept them sort of externally focused, they weren't really having an intercultural dialogue about, how should we reformulate our religion. A lot of it was external. Not to say that scholasticism wasn't internal, not to say that there weren't other pursuits of truth, not to say that there weren't other religious reforms or the contests between the papacy and King Henry IV in Germany. That obviously happened, but once those external enemies became fewer and fewer and farther between, and once Europeans started to colonize and started to venture out into Africa and Asia with Marco Polo, and then they also started to think internally, and they started to think, hey, what are the roots of the tradition? Who are we? They had time to stop and think. They no longer assumed who they were. They no longer assumed doctrine, but they started, really science, in my opinion, started with religion. Science started with the question of, hey, what is this thing we have called religion? Well, who is God? What is it based off? Where do we get knowledge of God? From this text, right, the Bible, or from this tradition. But whence does that come from? Where does that come from? What people? What culture? So this identity crisis that Europe goes through when it goes through this monumental shift of transitioning from being under constant attack by Vikings and constant crusades against the Slavs and crusades against the Moors in Spain and everything else, and then they sort of get some breathing room and they say, who are we, by the way? Who are we? And that crisis of identity, which a lot of it happens in northwestern Europe, of Protestants saying, hey, are we really like Romans? Are we really Latin peoples? No, we're Germanic peoples. We're Nordic people. We need a religion that's authentic to our experience. We shouldn't be controlled by Rome. We don't want to be controlled by the Pope down there. We want our independence spiritually, philosophically. And so they go through a kind of identity crisis, and that's where Protestantism comes from, and that's where Freemasonry comes from, which sort of blurs the line between Protestantism and Hermeticism and alchemy and all of those different tracts. Freemasonry contains a lot of different things, a lot of different currents within it, and it splits off into Illuminati, and it splits off into Enlightenment and secularism and atheism and agnosticism, and it splits off into classical liberalism, and there's all these different currents that are intersecting. But at the end of the day, it's a European identity crisis that's been going on for a while. Now, while Europe has been undergoing that crisis, Europe has at the same time been expanding and releasing a lot of potential energy out onto the world and coming up with new scientific inventions, because as they question themselves, they become more adept at questioning reality and saying, how does this work? Could we make this machine better? This skepticism, this turning things over, how can we make this better? How can we make it more efficient? Never just stopping and assuming the form, or just taking it for what it is. Always looking at something, oh, well, I see you've made it like that, but could we do one step better? That spirit, you could call it a Faustian spirit, the expansion of space, has characterized Europe for a while. And we're now at the point where, Europe has exhausted a lot of its potential energy, and it's looking to, in a way, settle down, and it's in this old age period where it wants to come to terms with what's happened and come up with some solution, some kind of dogmatic doctrinal solution. And this is a process that's happened continuously, but we're now in an age where Europe and Europeans, they're looking at a period where they say, well, we've tried so many different things. We've tried a sexual revolution. We've tried a racial revolution. We've tried democratic revolutions. We've tried every sort of revolution. We've asked ourselves, could this work? Could that work? And then we've just tried it out, right? We've just said, okay, we'll give it a go. Hey, someone said maybe we should emancipate the Jews, and that'll solve the Jewish question. Okay, well, give them all the rights and freedoms, and we'll just see what happens. So a lot of these processes have been going on, and now we see what happens, and there's this desire to now collect our thoughts and to assess and say, okay, well, how can we standardize? How can we codify? How can we cement these changes into an ethical, moral reality? And the situation that we're in is we're starting to collect more and more sociological data and say, hey, when we just have this total free-for-all, a sexual free-for-all, a racial free-for-all, a cultural free-for-all, a philosophical, religious free-for-all, when everything is a free-for-all, that has consequences. Because as it turns out, people, Europeans included, are dogmatic thinkers. The vast majority of people are dogmatic thinkers. They need to be told how to think, what to think, when to think, who to think. Language is set up in this way. Language implicitly, and Chomsky says this, that language implicitly contains meaning. And we are given language. We don't make it, no one invents language. All invented language ultimately is traced back from given language. If you're not given a language, you can't invent a language because you have no reference to build upon. I can say, well, instead of calling it an apple, I'm going to call it a yablaka. Okay, it's a yablaka. What is a yablaka? Well, it's an apple. If no one ever told me what an apple was, if I was never given the word apple, and I wasn't given just linguistic thinking as a structure to think about this object called an apple, then I wouldn't be able to come up with a new word, right? So to even consider the concept of language creation cannot be done in a linguistic vacuum. And this is perhaps why generative anthropology is so important, because generative anthropology deals with the question of, well, if language can't be created ex nihilo, if you can't create language without a structure to build upon, then how can we even conceive of a pre-linguistic period in human development? It's very difficult. Was it a single instance? Was it a gradual evolution? How did that happen? And these kind of evolutionary questions are very common, especially creationist versus evolutionist debates. Like the eye is very complex. How does something like the eye, which is so complex, how does it evolve gradually? it's very difficult to conceive of. Now we can see intermediary forms. We can see like a nematode has maybe an eye spot, and that sort of develops more complexity and eventually gets to a primitive eyeball and eye socket. All of these questions are very interesting from an engineering standpoint, I guess. But language is such an important one because it influences our perception of meaning, of philosophy, of ethics, of politics. And so understanding the way that this structure came about, the way that it generated, seems to be very important, and it's not a question that's really taken seriously. It's a very puzzling, paradoxical one. How do we conceive of the generation of language? Before I heard about generative anthropology, I think it was De Vico, the philosopher Vico, and I believe that his theory of language development was that giants saw lightning and they screamed. They screamed out of fear. And when they screamed, this scream then was repeated to refer to the lightning. And that this is where language came from, by people just having guttural reactions to events and then connecting those sounds with the event itself, and that created this concept of a sound referring to an object in space. That might be inaccurate. I didn't read him, I just read an article about him. So it's a very interesting question. And that's really what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the definition of oneself as a success or a failure. We know there are situations in which people define themselves. They say, my goal in life is to be drunk every day as a homeless man, and I achieved that. Therefore, I'm successful. Well, we can look at that person and say, I'm sorry, you might have a fantasy of success, or you might imagine yourself as successful, but you're really not. Or someone who says, my goal is to have as much gay sex as possible before I die. And you say, okay, well, according to your definitions, you're successful, but at the end of your life, when you're sick and you're dying and you don't have any children, you don't have any wife or anything like that, are you going to be happy with that decision? Is that really the ideal, really the goal you want to pursue? Hedonism. Do you really just want to play video games all the rest of your days, your life? Do you all the games you play and all the porn you watch and all of the hedonistic activity you engage with, when you die, are you going to look back and say, oh, I'm glad I engaged in this private hedonism? Or are you going to say, I wish I had impacted the lives of others, or I wish I had been part of a community, or I wish I left something to my descendants, or, how are you going to think about your actions on your deathbed? I think that's an important perspective. It's what the medieval Europeans called memento mori, remember you must die. That's not something, we have the opposite. We have YOLO, which is you only live once, and it implies that you should be hedonistic because you only have one life. I mean, in my opinion, that's probably not true. I mean, the way that I look at reincarnation is that the theory of reincarnation, if we were to propose, okay, you're going to be reincarnated, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean you get to keep your memories. I don't think anyone really claims that. I mean, some people claim that they have memories, but most people say, well, you don't have access to those memories, or they're difficult to access, or you need to meditate upon them, or you need psychic powers, or whatever. Most people who believe in reincarnation don't say you can have your ancestral memories. Most people say you lose your memories, and you get a new set of genes. You don't have the exact same genes, but you get a new set of genes, and you have a new environment. So in some sense, you're still the same person, like your soul is the same, but your soul is put into a different genetic structure and is put into a different environment. So the question is, are you the same person or are you a different person? Well, if we assume that there is some kind of inviolable soul, some kind of immortal, eternal soul, which can never be changed, or it can never be corrupted, or can never be killed, it can never die, and we assume that the soul is put in a new genetic structure, it's put into a new environment, well, in some senses, the person is the same because they have the same soul. But in other senses, in the sense that the person is a construct of genes and environment, it's a different person. And this is unfalsifiable. I can't prove reincarnation. Technically, you can't also disprove it because, it's unfalsifiable, right? if I was to have this conception of reincarnation, then I would look out at humanity and I would say we're all very similar. We all have a very similar genetic structure, and we also have a very similar pattern of experience of our environment. We all experience tragedy, we all experience triumph, we all experience good times and bad times. So in that sense, we're all pretty much the same person with slight variations on the theme. And there are some people who live life in a hedonistic way. And so my perspective is like, okay, I might not get to experience all of the hedonistic pleasures of life. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of things a lot of amazing experiences that I will never experience, either because of my own choice or because of my lack of opportunity. But somewhere out there on this planet is experiencing those experiences. So to the extent that we're really all the same person, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't bother me that much. What bothers me more than the idea of, oh my gosh, what is it? FOMO. That's the other one. After YOLO, we now have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out. So we have a fear of missing out. And I don't really have that fear of missing out in terms of hedonism, but I do have the fear that I'm going to die, and I'm going to say, well, what was the point of it all? Why did I even bother? I'm going to end up like Kim Philby or Jack Philby, or I'm going to end up like the Yabik Party, where my original intent in life was not pursued, or it was not enacted, or the institutions that I helped create then became subverted and worked against my original purpose. You know, that's a scary thought. But of course, you know you're going to fail 100% if you don't try. You know you're going to fail 100% if you don't try. If you're not trying to create an institution, then you're 100% not going to leave anything to your descendants. So when I say institution, I'm trying to speak more broadly than a company or a political group. Institution means any superstructure. You're trying to build any structure, whether it's a career or a house or anything. You're trying to create something that will survive you. Now, there is the perspective that essentially, you know, no matter what you do, the universe is going to do what it does. That we're so small that anytime we try to intervene in grand affairs, the great currents of history sort of sweep us in their direction. So we try to fight communism. How do we try to fight communism? Well, we support the American empire. So the Soviet Union falls, but then what happens? America turns communist. So, you know, you tried to fight communism by building up the CIA, building up the FBI, building up NATO, building up the European Union. You tried to build up these Western countries against the Soviet Union, and then they just got subverted from the inside, and now they're de facto communist. In certain respects, we could say, oh, they're culturally communist or something. They've moved to the left in certain respects. So you can, as an individual, try to change history, and then even if you're very successful by several metrics, you can end up, your whole project can end up working against itself. Because there are more fundamental processes at work. There are more fundamental forces at work. And as you try, it's almost as if, you know, it's a convergent evolution that you have. We know about the rhinoceros, right? We also know about Triceratops. Now, rhinoceros is ultimately descended from rats. It's a mammal. Triceratops is ultimately descended from lizards, and yet rhinoceros and Triceratops are remarkably alike. They're these very heavy, armored, stocky, four-footed animals, and they've got horns on the front, and they look remarkably similar because it's almost as if there's this Platonic form that exists out there in the ether somewhere, and that these small lizards and small mammals are just converging to this form. They're just trying to fit that form. Like the form already exists out there, and they're just trying to, it's like water into a cup, water into a vessel. You pour the water, and it just fills the vessel. And that's what lizards and mammals do. When a lizard becomes a triceratops, when a rat becomes a rhinoceros, they are filling an already existing mold. And so as we try to fight communism by, you know, increasing the power of the American empire, at the same time that we try to push toward our own vision, in the same way that the lizard and the rat, they're just trying to survive. They're not trying to become a rhinoceros. They're not trying to become a triceratops. But because of these grand pressures from the environment, they're being forced into these roles that they couldn't have predicted. It's not a Lamarckian evolution necessarily that the lizard wanted to become a triceratops or that the rat wanted to become a rhinoceros, but it was sort of through a slow, gradual process over time. There was this erosion of forms, and they were sort of forced into these positions simply by the fact that they were trying to survive. And so long as you're trying to survive, you're going to be subject to the rules of survival in your environment, so whatever your environmental pressures are. And this seems to be what happens culturally and politically, is that, try as you might, as long as you're trying to survive politically, you're going to continuously move in a direction politically that approximates, the best fit for this current global environment. And so as you continue to defend Americanism, in order to defend America and promote the survival of America, you end up redefining American values as communist values. And that's how you promote America. And it's this unwitting, unconscious thing that happens. But that's sort of what ends up happening. And we can question, what are the environmental factors here? Are the environmental factors like human sociology? Is it technology? Is it the erosion of religion? Is it, a cabal of a Rothschild family or a Rockefeller family? Or is it some kind of super rich billionaire class? What are the environmental factors here? What are the axiomatic features of our environment that push ideological systems in one direction? Like, they all seem to be going toward the same direction. Like Russia and the far, Slavic East continues to push in a liberal direction. Saudi Arabia is pushing in a liberal direction. Sure, they're starting from a very misogynist point. They're starting from the point of not letting women drive, and then they slowly start letting women drive, and they slowly, they're not going to show Hollywood movies, but they'll show a censored version. Same thing with China. So everyone seems to be moving in this direction continuously, globally. And it's up for debate. What are the axiomatic causes? Is it a small group of individuals? Is it a single ethnic group? Is it technology, as I said before? What is it? Or is it all of the above? And are these various axiomatic causes actually sort of interdependent in a sense? If we talk about the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds or some important family, how did they become important? Because of their utilization of technology. Well, how did we come to this point where we had a technological society? How did technology get invented? Technology had to be invented through a scientific method. How did we get that scientific method? Well, it had to come through a philosophical revolution in thought. Well, how did we get that? Well, it was through a cultural evolution. Well, what was that caused by? Maybe it was, and part of the reason why I'm thinking this way is because I have started to watch, I haven't finished it, I started to watch the alt-hype video on Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a lot about, we have Native American civilization, we have European civilization, we have these different civilizations. How did they come to differentiate? What were the environmental factors at play? And then Arvol also has put out a video on, sort of ancient archaeology and these megalithic structures. Megalithic just means big stones. So there's these big stone structures. How did they come to be? And these sort of questions. I don't have all the answers, but it's an interesting train of thought. So what are we supposed to do? When I read Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae, one of the things that stood out to me was her suggestion that great art was created through suffering, that great art, and actually civilization itself, was created as a sort of therapy to distract from the ugliness of the world, that the world is inherently Chthonian and ugly, that the world is just a big molten, disgusting, hellish rock floating in empty, cold space, and there's this veneer, this thin skin of crust upon which vegetation grows and humanity lives and dies. And Polly was saying that our conception of the earth as being green and blue and placid and pleasant is a perverse illusion. It's a mirage. It's Maya of the reality, which is that Earth, 99% of it is a hellish landscape, a molten, churning, disgusting, inhuman, ungeheuer. It's that's the German word for it. It's a horrendous, it's monstrous. So she says that this is what all of civilization is. This is what masculinity is. It is an attempt to disguise the true facts of the reality, which is that everything's ugly, everything's disgusting. It's an attempt to distract from that, which is an interesting idea. It's a very pessimistic idea, but it's an interesting idea. And part of the consequence of that is that people who experience more suffering, more abuse, more hardship, end up becoming very good artists, because they're constantly trying to escape this refrain in their brain that they're constantly reliving the memories of their bad experiences, and to escape from that, or to distract from that, or to have this self-therapy, they produce great paintings or great artwork or great literature or great sculptures or great plays or great books in order to distract themselves as a sort of catharsis, to relieve themselves of the pain that they constantly relive from their post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from this hardship that they encountered, which is an interesting concept, which implies that if you like great art and you appreciate great art, then the only way that you can have more of it and to create it yourself is you have to confront suffering and hardship and struggle and stress, and only then are you going to have the inspiration that this negative event in your life or series of events is going to impel you to flee from it and try to compensate for it through great art. Whereas if you're just a everyday normal guy and nothing's really that hard in your life, nothing's too difficult, every day is like the next, nothing bad has ever happened to you, you're never going to create great art because you have no reason to create great art. You're not trying to escape from anything. You're happy where you are. You're complacent where you are. So Polya puts forth the suggestion that greatness or great good, great art, requires great evil, which is sort of a reversal of the Epicurean formula. The Epicurean formula being, hey, if God is so good, then why is there evil? She sort of reverses that and say, in order to have goodness, in order to create good things, we have to have some kind of evil that we are struggling against. And if there's nothing evil in the world, if everything is good and everything is relative and everything is blasé, there's this ennui, and nothing good can come out of that. Nothing great can come out of that. If you don't have suffering, you can't have beauty. And so if you eliminate suffering from the world, you eliminate poverty, you eliminate hunger, you eliminate thirst, you eliminate death, then you eliminate goodness, and you eliminate greatness, and you eliminate glory, is sort of what I took away from that. Now, I might be exaggerating, or I might be implying something that she didn't say, and she might disagree with my analysis, and that's fine. But that is a line of thinking that she inspired. Reading her work, Sexual Personae, I was inspired to start considering this possibility. And so to go back to the original point, how do we conceive of ourselves? Do we conceive of ourselves as successes or failures? Well, if we say, if you identify as white, then you say, well, I'm white, so I'm already a winner. I belong to the best race of all. I belong to the best civilization of all time. If you conceive of yourself in that way, is that advantageous, or is that detracting from your ability to do great things? Some people would say that if you have these great ancestors to live up to, then you're going to somehow use that as a role model, and that's going to inspire you to do great things, possibly. Another way to look at it is you would say, wow, look how far we've fallen from our ancestors. Maybe that's a kick in the pants. And so it sort of reverses itself. You see this constant reversal. If I say, look, Europeans have such great ancestors, what is the consequence? is the consequence that Europeans should conceive of themselves as a successful people. Europeans should say, our ancestors were so awesome, therefore we're great. We're great because our ancestors were great. That's one way to take it. But another way to take it is we're losers. We're failures. We're disgusting. We're just pathetic. Because look how great our ancestors were, and look how, in comparison, look how weak and lacking all respect, and lacking all honor, and lacking all virtue, and lacking all higher thinking and high culture and high spirituality. We've debased ourselves and we hate ourselves, and rightly so, because look how far we've fallen. In fact, we're not the best race. Having the best ancestors doesn't make you, the best race. It actually makes you the worst race, because look how far you've fallen. Look at all you were given. Look at all you were bequeathed. Look at everything that you were set up for, and look how far you fell. And some people could compare this to, Satan being, or Lucifer being, the right hand of God, being the highest angel of God, and then falling to the greatest depths. And that makes Satan the worst villain of all time. Well, white people, you could even say there's a parallel there, where white people were so high, they were so virtuous, they were so moral, they were so ethical, they were so scientific, they were so concerned with honor and virtue. And look how far they've fallen to be the lowest of the low. And isn't that sort of a Luciferian story? I mean, we could even, in a Christian context, a supersessionist context, we could look at the Jewish people. Look, they were the apple of God's eye. They were the chosen people of God. And now look how far they've fallen from the path. Now look how far they've fallen. So it's not even something I'm putting out there as a statement of fact. But I'm sort of putting out these parallel narratives to get people thinking about this concept of success versus failure. Do you want to think of yourself as a success, or do you want to think of yourself as a failure? There are positives and negatives in both ways, in both directions. And I think some of it could be individual. You could just say, well, some people, they just operate better if they wake up in the morning and say, I'm a great person, power of positive thinking, I'm so cool, look at me. And that's sort of the Donald Trump school of philosophy, that you just wake up every morning, you say, I'm a successful person. Jim Carrey, law of attraction. Jim Carrey promotes the law of attraction, where he says, if you just visualize $10 million checks, you're going to get a $10 million check. That's how Jim Carrey says he became successful. So there are people who view things that way, of just be positive, just think of yourself well, and to the point of arrogance and narcissism, really. And then everything good is going to happen. And then I think there are other people where it's like you actually need to kick yourself in the pants, and you need to get to that depraved state, that Jobian state, that ancient Hebrew state, that early Christian state, that state where you say, I'm nothing. Everything I touch turns to a disaster, it's a catastrophe. I need some kind of higher power out there. I need to completely lay myself low. And actually, Islam has a similar conception where when you pray, you get yourself as low to the ground as possible, symbolizing your total depravity. And then you offer yourself up to God, and you try to infuse yourself, you welcome in the Spirit of God so that you can finally do something good for once. Not because you're doing it through your own capacity, but because you're allowing God to supplant your own disgusting wickedness, and you're basically opening up a power vacuum within yourself and allowing God to fill that vacuum. You could even compare like Buddhist meditation and stuff, that you're trying to empty your mind of thoughts, all thought completely, and that puts you in a sort of suggestive state where you can wipe yourself clean, tabula rasa, and you can allow something new to come in. You can allow something different to come in. You can have a reset, and you can allow something new and different to come in. You can rebuild yourself. So I don't know. I think different people are going to take different strategies, and there might not be just one strategy that works for everybody. I don't think everyone's just going to go out there and be a narcissist. I think some of it is physiognomy and your phenotype and your physical appearance. I think people who just look... They just look successful, right? So Donald Trump, if he goes out there and he says, I'm the best businessman ever, I guess people will buy that, and he can go somewhere with that. And then other people just have a naturally more serious face, or a more pessimistic face or something, and they can't exactly push that through, and they come off as a sociopath or a psychopath when they promote themselves. And it would be a lot more natural for them to come from a position of humility and to say, no, I don't deserve any credit for this. Really, the glory goes to God. It's interesting sometimes people who look, sports athletes or whatever, sometimes the humility comes off as disingenuous. I see this sometimes with Protestant preachers or something, pastors who will say, oh, I've done nothing good and I'm worthless and everything, and it's all about God. It's like, sometimes you can go too far with that. So it's not one directional. There's no one solution here, but it's about understanding yourself on this spectrum and sort of trying to adjust yourself accordingly to get toward a better situation. I don't know how to analyze people in this respect. I'm not providing an answer or a solution here, but more I'm providing a set of solutions. I'm providing a range of solutions that you have to, individually by yourself. I don't know you. I don't know who you are. I don't understand my audience. How can I understand my audience if I don't understand myself? I see this guy, and I don't even know how far I want to go into it, because I see people and I see they have problems and I see they don't understand themselves, and who am I to presuppose that I can psychologize a person from afar, identify their weaknesses, identify their strengths, and then give them some kind of prescription of behavior of how they should change themselves? Just in general, I would tell people, try to be more healthy, because there is a mind-body connection. Schopenhauer talks about this. The body's the first thing we perceive, and so if we treat our body badly, it's very symbolic of how we think of ourselves. If we don't want to improve our bodies, then how can we want to improve anything else about ourselves? The body is the least abstract property that we have, that we take ownership of, before the mind, before spirituality, before any of that. So take care of your body. Be careful about what you put into your body. Realize that the real global flooding that's going on is not the rising sea levels on the coast. The global flooding that's going on is the flooding of the water supply with antidepressants and toxic chemicals and this cocktail in the tap water. It's just generally worsening our mental health. Just statistically, mental health is decreasing. We're becoming more depressed, more anxious, more suicidal. Everything is, look at the fact that, school shootings are rising, not because people have greater access to guns. Kids had more access to guns back in the day. 1960s is the picture of JFK. He's giving a speech and a kid has a toy gun and it's held up to his face kind of like this. He's kind of holding it up like this and listening to JFK. And no one cared because it wasn't a problem. It now is a problem. In the 90s, with the death of the Soviet Union, America lost its reason to live. It lost its external opponent, and so it began to deconstruct itself internally, and that's really when you had this rise of the 90s kids and the school shootings, and it just gets worse and worse every day. It doesn't seem to stop. So there is a huge problem that's related to, we don't care what's in our tap water. We don't care what we drink. We don't care what we eat. Obesity continues to rise. We don't care about ourselves. If we don't respect ourselves, if we can't love ourselves, how can we love our neighbor? Christ says, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if you don't love yourself, if you don't respect yourself, if you don't want good things for yourself, if you're being hedonistic with yourself, you're going to be hedonistic with other people. You're going to be sadistic with other people. You're going to be masochistic with other people. If you're not building up yourself, how can you build up other people? So if you don't take yourself and your own body and care about what you put in it, and again, it doesn't have to be for selfish reasons. You can view it as you're a servant of God and you want to respect this temple God has given you because it's a gift He's given you for a temporary amount of time while you're here on this earth. You don't own it permanently. It's something, you are essentially you're tending to the garden, and the garden is your body. It's something He's entrusted you with. So He's not going to give you more responsibilities if you can't even take care of your own body. So people need to address the cause of their obesity. They need to address the cause of their lack of health, and that's very difficult. And there's a huge amount of resources we could direct a huge amount of resources toward reverse osmosis and providing people with clean water, and people actually caring about the quality of the water. Oh, there's just antidepressants in the water. Oh, I guess we'll just drink it anyway. If we could get people to care about it, and we could put forth the money to come up with a solution, there is a solution, then there's so much that we would save in terms of the mental health problems, the birth defects, all of the problems that we end up having to pay for down the road. That would be a great investment if we could make that investment, but we can't make that investment if we don't care. If we don't care. The first environment is the human body, right? We often think of people as living on the planet Earth. No, your environment is your body. You live inside your body. So if you're not, forget about the planet Earth. If we're not taking care of our bodies, how can we save the planet Earth? This is my problem with the direction of environmentalism under big corporate democracy, is that we have ignored the health aspect, and now you have fat, obese women calling for, these fat, obese vegans or whatever, calling for climate change funding or taxation or climate change dictatorial powers given to the government. They want climate change action. They want to ban fossil fuels or something. They don't even take care of their own bodies. They abuse their own bodies. They mark up their own bodies with tattoos and ear piercings, and they disrespect their bodies sexually. They disrespect. They're lustful, etc. They're slothful. The way they spend their time. Isn't that the first environment? Isn't environmentalism, if you care about how the forest looks and we want to have our trees be pretty, we want the sidewalks free of trash, and we want to save all these animals that are going extinct, well, first care about yourself, care about your own body. And of course that can be superficial. People want a quick fix, so they're still living the unhealthy life, but then they compensate with testosterone replacement and steroids so that they can look big and buff, but they haven't really taken the negative aspects out of their life. They've just smothered the negative aspects with, throwing on more testosterone, throwing on steroids to mask the problem. In the same way, let's say you have a problem because you're weak. You're weak, and so you have pain. Well, rather than building yourself up and solving that pain, that, if it's joint pain, maybe it's a postural issue. Maybe you have bad posture. Maybe I have bad posture right now. And maybe because of your bad posture, maybe we should have a posture segment in every single video. That'd really improve my posture. But if you have bad posture and you're slouched over all the time, right? And you say, I got this neck pain, I got this back pain. Well, maybe try to fix your habits, try to build yourself up, try to improve rather than popping an Advil. And this is something that I think is so important for young people, because it's so much easier to change your habits when you're young rather than when you're old. So try to care about these issues from a young age. All these young people who care about climate change, it's like, okay, well, before we care about the rising sea levels, which is the least of my worries. I don't care if San Francisco goes underwater. There's nothing to save here. There's nothing I want to preserve in San Francisco. But, before we even care about that, let's care about not just the beauty of the environment out there, but the environment right here, this environment. The body is the first environment we're given. So, an environmentalist should care about obesity first and foremost, not rising sea levels. No, obesity. This is a fundamental problem. Why do we care about the environment? We care about our descendants. We care about what we're bequeathing them. We care about the diversity of the world. We care about all these issues. It seems to be a distraction from the very present and very immediate catastrophic. People are killing themselves every day. People are losing connection to others. People are just perverting their minds. and being burdened down with mental illness, where again, it's easier to break a vase than to stitch it back together. If you break glass, if you shatter glass, I can take a piece of glass and I can shatter it instantly. But to put that glass back together to its original state is almost impossible. You really have to melt it down, which is to say you just have to wipe the slate clean, totally murder the glass essentially with hot heat, and then you can remold that glass into a new piece, which I think, is sort of analogous to reincarnation. But there comes a point with mental illness and physical illness where it would be easier just to say, hey, better luck next time with the next generation, rather than pumping millions of dollars to support the last 6 months of this person's life on life support, which is what we do now. We worship the extension of the quantity of life rather than having a conception of, hey, no. We don't care about the quantity, how long you can drag out someone's life. We care about the quality. We're not going to try to extend, we're not going to try to take something that's already broken and fix it. We're going to focus on the next generation. People seem to not care about the next generation, and the way that they care about the next generation is in a very perverse sense. We care about the next generation in the sense that we find the kids with cancer and we throw millions of dollars at the kids with cancer, and I think that's perverse. Rather than trying to find the best of our children and building them up. Because the only way we're going to progress into future generations is if we take the best of our kids and we throw millions of dollars at them. We say, hey, you have such great potential. Let's make sure this doesn't get messed up. Let's make sure we can extract that potential. Let's make sure that you can blossom and bloom into a great person someday. Rather than take someone who is clearly, genetically or environmentally, whatever, they've been stricken by a disease, and we're going to throw millions of dollars at that kid to try to get them to survive so that they can live as a mediocre person for the rest of their life. That to me seems to be very perverse and wrong-headed. That we've come to a point where we can no longer accept the concept of death. We can no longer accept the concept that, we're all going to die someday, and really the only purpose of us here on this planet is not to extend our quantity of life, but it's to contribute to the lives of others to the extent that we are capable, to form communities, to form loving relationships. I mean, how many people can say that they have 0 loving relationships? There's an alarming increase every single day of the number of people say, well, I don't have anyone I can rely upon. I don't have anyone I can confide in. I don't have anyone who I trust. Every single one of my social interactions is superficial. Every single one of my social interactions is deceitful. People ask me how I'm doing. I say fine. I say okay. And that's fine when you're at the grocery store, and that's fine with strangers. But if you don't have someone to come home to at the end of the day and confide in, and it doesn't have to be even, I'm not even talking about a romantic partner here. I'm talking about close friends. How many people don't have any close friends? How many people could say, my best friend is online? I mean, how sad is that you can't be in the same room? I mean, we are physical creatures in physical bodies. We are meant to be in communion physically. We're meant to hug. We're meant to shake hands. We're meant to hold hands. In fact, we're meant to embrace. We're meant to spar. We're meant to wrestle. We're meant to be tactile creatures. If you don't hug a baby, the baby's going to get sick and die of basically mental illness, of heartbreak. You have to hug babies, and just because we're grown up doesn't mean we don't need hugs anymore. People aren't getting enough hugs, and we don't even have people who we emotionally trust enough that we can hug them. We have lost that sense of intimacy. We've lost that ability to trust in one another. Social trust decreases. And the result is that we've lost a fundamental nutrient. Vitamin H, the hugs, and I'm just taking that as an example. I'm not saying that that's your only method of friendship, is that, hugs are the only thing that matters. And sometimes you see leftists where, they talk about free hugs, or I'm just going to hug strangers, or I just hug everybody. Well, then it becomes meaningless, right? It becomes meaningless. And it doesn't matter anymore because it's not genuine. The hug at the end of the day is a symbol of an emotional connection. And so if you just hug people but there's no emotional connection there, then it's an empty gesture. So I'm not saying take it in that direction, but I'm saying that we have a fundamental problem here, and that people should be hugging each other. And again, I get it, Northwest Europeans are not the most touchy-feely people, just in general, ancestrally, you look throughout the history, and that's just the way they are. But at the end of the day, you should have at least one person in your life where you can be intimate with that person, you can confide in that person. And a lot of times we have this romantic Hollywood expectation that this person is going to be your marital partner. Now, of course, it would be nice if your marital partner could fulfill all these roles. Unfortunately, with the rate of divorce today, everyone is suspect. You can't marry someone with a reasonable expectation that this is someone you can trust, because most marriages end in divorce. So fundamentally, people can throw out all the promises that, I'll love you forever. Yes, I promise to be faithful through sickness and good health and whatever. And then there's a very good chance societally that this person's going to divorce you. Not because they're even necessarily a bad person, but because every relationship has three people. There's no such thing as a relationship between two people. Every relationship, even if you're on a deserted island and there's only two people, the relationship between that two people is a relationship between three people. It's you, the other person, and society. And society, let's say, it's two people and they come from different cultures. Okay, well, it's the metaculture, it's the global culture, it's the human culture, it's whatever cross-cultural connection you can have, whatever communicative method you have, whatever gestural method you have of communication, that is the third person. That is your and some people would call that the Holy Spirit, but basically that is the medium through which you make a connection. And if that medium, if we live in a society of divorce, then it's not that you're a bad person, it's not that your marital partner is a bad person, it's that society is a bad person, and society is bringing about the divorce. And that's where the problem lies. So you're never going to find the perfect partner who will never divorce you. Really what you need to have is a subculture that is capable of supplanting society as being the third person in your relationship. So before we can even hug each other, before we can even have that connection, before we can even have friends, before we can have trust between individuals, we need to have social trust. We need to have a third person. We need to have a subculture. We need something that binds us together. And that discovering that and building that and developing that everyone is so fractured, as John David Ebert says, we're in a post-metaphysical age where each individual has their own metaphysic. There's no common metaphysic that we can rely on to understand one another. You look at the bond shared by twins, because twins share the same genetics and they share the same environment usually. And so there's this great bond between twins because they understand each other, they trust each other, they understand each other's motivations. And so there's not this constant worry that this person's going to betray me, this person's going to lie to me, this person's going to deceive me, because they understand one another, because they have a common genetic framework they're working off of. Well, people need that. People need that culturally. And we need to understand where we fit in culturally. I don't have a solution that is necessarily going to work for everyone. I wish there was such a thing, but Christianity did not convert all of the Jews. Judaism still exists. So Christianity tried to be a universal solution for everybody. Everyone's going to be a Christian. Well, some Jews said, no, I'm fine being a Jew, and you're not going to convince me otherwise. And the Jews have been smart enough and powerful enough that they've resisted conversion for a very long time, and will continue to do so, it seems, indefinitely. And then you had the Muslims who said, Christianity is great, but I think we want to make a few revisions. I think we want to add some things onto it. And so Christianity, again, tried to come up with this universal final solution to this problem of intimacy and this problem of identity. And it wasn't a final solution. Then you had Islam, and then of course you had the East-West split, and then you had the North-South split with Catholicism and Protestantism. So the splits that happened within Judaism, within Christianity, I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution. I don't think there is one solution that's going to fit everybody. I don't think I could write a book of ethics, or a book of how you should behave, or a book of what your cultural norm should be, or I could come up with some kind of common framework or linguistic framework or some kind of universal globalism that's going to work for everybody. Because obviously a lot of people are dissatisfied with this universalistic globalism. And they're not fitting into it. A lot of people are. A lot of people look at universalism and globalism and they say, that's just great, I love it, it's for me. A lot of people are not fitting into it. So finding out, is there a way that people can have their system, that they can have their millet. It's coming from Arabic millah. Millet means nation in the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, there was the Rum millet, the Rum millah. And the Rum millah, or the Rum millet, was the Roman nation. And that was everyone who was a white European Christian. And the Greeks and the Vlachs and the Armenians, and, well, not necessarily the Armenians. I think they were considered a separate nation. But anyway, there was a whole host of Europeans that were put into the category of the Rum millet. People need to find their millet. We have this imperial system similar to the Ottoman Empire. We need to find our millet, and we need to bind together and have our autonomy within that and struggle for that autonomy. But you look at the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't constant holy war between Christians and Muslims, but they were able to come to some kind of agreement of like, hey, we're going to be the Rum millet, and you're going to be the Muslims, and those over there, those are the Armenians, and we all maintain ourselves. And that was a system that worked for a while, and eventually it collapsed. And now we have we see different countries have developed out of the Ottoman Empire. But I think we're in an Ottoman mode right now, and we need to come up with some kind of system that each individual in this empire can find their own millet. They can find their own millah. They can find their own nation. It's not going to be ethnostates. The Ottoman Empire was not a series of ethnostates. The Ottoman Empire was a series of millets. So I'm not even for nationalism in the sense of geographical nations or ethnostates. But I think people do need their own millet. You need something that you can identify with, because just floating out there in space is a very radical place to be. It's a very violent place to be. It's a very self-destructive place to be, and it's very harmful for yourself and everyone around you. So people need to find their millet, and there needs to be something that we can organize around. And that's difficult to do given the geographical separation at hand. Where people are moving around all the times for work and career and school and everything. It's hard to have a local community. That's something that is one of the most tragic features, I think. The idea that you can't grow up in a house and have your next door neighbor be your best friend and just grow old together and die together. The opportunity for things like that, to have a local community and to connect. Even if you move far away, you can always come back on vacation. You can always visit for Christmas. The fact that things like that are dying is very disturbing. And it's a lot more disturbing to me than something like racial replacement or demographic changes. Demography is not destiny. I mean, the idea that we have this democratic ideal now that demography is destiny, because if the Mexicans are a majority, then it's going to be a Mexican country. Well, that's just not the case. I mean, are the Jews a majority? No. Are they surviving and thriving? Yeah. So you don't need to be a majority to be surviving and thriving. That's not a prerequisite. Demographics are not destiny at all. What really matters is media is destiny, money is destiny, power is destiny. But that has nothing to do with demographics at the end of the day. Demographics, birth rates are worthless, they're useless, they mean nothing. So capturing populism is really this democratic fallacy that's sold by elites. Democracy was invented by elites to distract people. Conspiracy theories are often defended, or they're invented to distract people. They're invented to distract people from the fact that the way that the government works, the way that power works, is very out in the open, and it's not really hard to understand. And they would rather have people concerned with finding time cube and everything and finding Masonic symbols. And it's like, look, we know who the rich people are. We know who is in power. This is not a difficult question. The question is, are you willing to do what it takes to gain power yourself, or do you have some other goal in mind? Do you have a different strategy? So I don't know. But I think that's all for today. Thanks for listening. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.